this is Hooghly River, often called Ganga or Bhagirathi. Along this river, from Bay of Bengal that side, British, Danish, Portuguese, and Dutch settlements started for about 100 years towards north that way from the time of Mughal King Akbar. About 400 years back, Job Charnock, an East India Company officer, bought three villages, Sutanuti up there, and Govindapur up there on the south, from then Jamindar Subarna Rai Chaudhary. It was 1690, Job Charnock, at the time of Mughal King Aurangzeb, founded the city of Calcutta at the central village then named Kolkata. The city was located at the east bank of river Ganga and spread from Joda Bagan on the north to Chandpal Ghat on the south. Since the city was founded, the main trading operations of East India Company moved to then Calcutta. Soon after, in 1701, a fortress called Fort William, named after British King William III, was built to protect British property and men. Mortars were brought from Madras to construct the fort, and the location of the fort was right at the center of city of Calcutta, up there, right behind the Fairly Place Ghat. This was the place at today's location of Customs House near Lal Dighi on current Strand Road in Dalhousie area of Kolkata, where the old Fort William was situated. Our story starts from here. In 1756, the British authorities started renovation of this decayed fort, including a new administrative building inside. The then Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-Ud-Daulah, just succeeded his grandfather Alivardi Khan, took this construction as without permission and viewed as a threat to his sovereignty. On 20th June 1756, the Nawab's army seized the fort and the city of Calcutta was renamed as Alinagar in memoriam of demised last Nawab Alivardi Khan. During the siege, about 164 British soldiers, Anglo-Indian soldiers and Indian civilians were imprisoned overnight in a small cramped room where 143 people died from suffocation and heat exhaustion. The incident is known as Black Hole of Calcutta. The death figure in later years was disputed to be heavily exaggerated, and those who could flee the siege started moving south towards this way to find some kind of British settlement for safety. This is Falta on the east bank of river Ganga. The name was Fulta at that time, which is today's Falta, about 50 kilometers south from Calcutta. There was a British East India Company fort here in Falta. This is the current ruin of this fort. It was a Dutch fort, but later taken over by the British and converted to East India Company fort. And there were British settlement in and around this fort. at the time of when the Fort William was seized. The fort was located very close to the river bank, right here. During and after the war at Fort William, many escaped and took refuge here in this settlement, and from here a messenger was sent to Robert Clive at the British Residency at Fort Davis in Madras. Main entrance of the fort. This is river bank in Falta, a popular picnic destination, and the fort was right here on the other side. Currently it is a residential area, the fort campus as well as the ramparts. Soon after, believed to be on 20th December 1756, Robert Clive, then a 32-year-old Lieutenant Colonel and Major Kilpatrick, arrived Falta here via Bay of Bengal up there. They arrived with their forces and the purpose was to rescue and retaliation. In the meantime, Warren Hastings, a young and aspiring 25-year-old British trader, was imprisoned by the Nawab in Murshidabad after a British surrender to the Nawab force in Qasim Bazar, where the British had a small garrison. He soon could escape and somehow reached Falta here through this way from Murshidabad. Hastings joined as a volunteer in Clive's force. Clive was impressed with him when they met, and soon he became close to Clive in the retaliation operations. It was here in this fort the Bengal European Battalion was formed, combining all existing regiments under Major Kilpatrick and Captain Cootie for the retaliation. The force then sailed up the Hooghly River from here this way on 27th December 1756, immediately after the Christmas. On 28th December 1756, the fleet arrived here near the village of Mayapur, a little south of current Bajbaj, where Nawab had a fort. Hearing the news of British force arriving, Manik Chand, the Nawab's governor of Calcutta or Alinagar at that time, assembled his troop of about 2,000 men at the fort and attacked the British force. The British force under Vice Admiral Watson retaliated, pouring shells towards Nawab's force. There was a heavy battle on 29 December 1756, and on 30th December Nawab's fort was mostly destroyed and taken by British. Unfortunately, we could not identify the exact location of the fort, but it was here on the east bank of Hooghly River. The location of the fort was a little north of the village Mayapur, and there was a large sum at the south of the fort. The fort was closed in 1793, and the remains of the fort cannot be traced anymore because most part of it was used for other British construction thereafter. However, this area is called Barud Ghar, or ammunition store of the British ships on Hooghly River bank. This was built soon after the battle, but again abandoned in 1801. Somewhere nearby could be a possible location where the fort was situated as estimated, and the sum could be that side. This place is located about 10 kilometers south of Bajbaj. After Nawab's defeat here, the British fleet then advanced upstream this way towards Calcutta. On the morning of December 31st, 1756, the British fleet sighted another Nawab's outpost, Fort Thana, or locally called Mukawa Thana, built to control the trade through the river and collect tax. The fort stood here on the west bank of Hooghly River on the west corner of current Botanical Garden near the Roxborough House. This is the Roxborough House. However, the British fleet saw here on the other side of the river the British ship Kingfisher, which arrived on the previous day, was anchored. It was learned that on the previous day there was a gun battle, and by the early afternoon Nawab's guns were silenced and Nawab forces abandoned the fort. On January 1st, 1757, British forces and ships, after demolishing all enemy defences, proceeded few miles up the river this way. On 2nd January 1757, early in the morning, the British force landed here near a mud fort of Nawab called Aligarh Fort or Aligarh, named after Nawab Ali Khan, about 3 miles up from the last location, Fort Tanha. As described in Stuart Reid's book, The Battle of Plassey, the location of the fort could be here near the meeting point of Hooghly and Adi Ganga, then called Govindapur Nala, close to current Fort William. As the British force drew near here, there was another battle in the morning, but within 2 hours the British force drove Nawab force out of here. From here, the British force was divided into two groups. Vice Admiral Watson's squadron, along with the ships Kent, Tiger, Bridgewater and Kingfisher, proceeded through river to engage the enemy at Fort William. And Robert Clive's column with sepoys began to march on land towards Calcutta. In the meantime, the troop of Nawab also abandoned the city of Calcutta. A detachment of British force under Captain Coote immediately occupied Fort William. They also captured Nawab's guns, mortars and large quantity of ammunition. All the sepoys and officers who fled after capture by Nawab were reinstated to their positions at the Fort William. This is Hastings House in Barasat, a little east of Calcutta. Being a trader and primarily residing in Calcutta, Warren Hastings had a bungalow here. Robert Clive used this house for his residence at that time and for retaliation planning. It was from here the attack on Nawab's camp in Hooghly on 9th January 1757 was administered. Also, it was here attack on Nawab's capital Murshidabad was planned. Barasat was then the nearest trading and inhabited city from then Calcutta or Fort William. It had good network to different cities including Nawab's capital Murshidabad. Thereafter, Clive arranged Hastings' return to Kasim Bazar or then Kasim Bazar. Clive appointed Hastings as his diplomatic agent to resume his pre-war activities. Hastings spoke local language and it was a very big advantage. Hastings then remained in Kasim Bazar as Clive's contact during the war. This building is currently a protected monument. This is Maratha Ditch Lane. Along this lane up to the river Hooghly this side and this side towards upper and lower circular roads, there used to be a ditch made by British. This ditch was made as a protection against Maratha Borghese then plundering to protect the city of Calcutta and Fort William on the east side. West side was already protected by Hooghly River. This is at the north end of the ditch, and these signboards still bear the history. This circular canal was not there, and this canal was built lot later. The ditch was later filled in to form that Maratha ditch lane and these upper and lower circular roads. This is Halsi Bagan Road at the crossing of Upper Circular Road. On the south side of the Halsi Bagan Road and on the east side of Maratha Ditch, Omi Chand, a businessman close to Nawab, had a garden called Omi Chand Garden. On learning the British attack on Hooghly, currently Shinchuda or Chuchuda, Nawab's reinforced army marched towards Calcutta on 3rd February 1757. Nawab Siraj-Ud-Daulah himself and his 40,000 men, 18,000 horses and 40 guns army arrived and camped here in this Omichand garden. On 4th February 1757 at midnight, a British battalion of about 1,500 soldiers with huge artillery and cannons approached the Nawab camp. The British force camped at the west side of the Maratha ditch this way. Under the cover of thick fog, British force attacked the Nawab's army. Due to poor visibility, firings from each side was at random, primarily targeting the horse gallop sound. British forces from the west side and Nawab's forces from the east side. Finally, Nawab's force could cross the ditch that side after a good British casualty. On 5th February 1757, the British forces attacked the Nawab's camps again during the early morning hours. In this battle, unofficially called the Calcutta Gauntlet, Clive marched his small force through the entire Nawab's camp despite being under heavy fire from all sides, and by noon British force broke through. The attack scared the Nawab into concluding the Treaty of Alinagar with the British on 5th February 1757 itself. The Nawab agreed to restore company's factories, allow fortification of Calcutta and restoring former privileges. On 9th February 1757, Nawab surrendered control of Calcutta, including the Fort William, promising to compensate the East India Company for damages suffered and to restore its privileges. On 11th February 1757, the Nawab and his army commenced return march to Murshidabad this way. This is the house of Robert Clive in Nagar Bazar, Damdam area. At this place there used to be an abandoned or closed Dutch or Portuguese factory, and when he was travelling between Fort William and Warren Hastings' house, he used to see this house. It is believed that he thought of buying this building or the house and convert it into his bungalow similar to Hastings. Eventually he did and lived here after the war. Here is this plaque still bearing the history. A last look of the history. This is bank of Hooghly River in Chandanagar. On 12th June 1757, Robert Clive and Major Kilpatrick with the army from Calcutta arrived here in Chandanagar and assembled a force. The force consisted of about 600 British, including about 170 artillery men, controlling 8 field pieces and 2 cannons. The force also had 90 recruited European soldiers, that is Danish from Srirampur and French from Chandanagar, and 2100 sepoys as well as 150 British sailors. On 13th June 1757, the whole troop marched for Murshidabad. The sepoys marched on shore, and Europeans with the supplies and artillery were towed up the river in 200 boats. The whole force then started forwarding north this way. Although Chandanagar was a French settlement area, but after the defeat of French by British Royal Navy on 23rd March 1757, when the French fort d'Orléans was destroyed, the settlement was under British at the time of Clive's and his forces' arrival here. This is current Dupli Museum, which used to be the house of then French Governor of India Joseph Marquis Dupli. It was from here on 14th June 1757 Robert Clive arranged sending a declaration of war to the Nawab. There are some original cannons in the museum bearing the history. Here is one more. This is Hooghly River bank in Chuchura, English name Chinchura, previous name Hooghly Chinchura, or earlier name Hooghly. There were Dutch settlements here on the west bank of the river. Clive's force, while passing through here, recruited some Dutch soldiers as well. There was also Nawab's army camp here, but was destroyed in British 9th January 1757 attack. And Clive's army passed through here without any resistance. This is current Commissioner House, built over a 1744 constructed Dutch Governor House. We wanted to go inside the building because there was a Dutch East India Company plaque still there, but unfortunately we did not get permission to enter. This is Hooghly Madrasa, and this used to be Dutch soldiers' barrack then. This marble plaque and these cannons still bearing the history. Robert Clive recruited the Dutch soldiers from here. This is Hooghly River bank in Bengal. Bengal used to be then Portuguese stronghold, and Robert Clive's force, when passing through here, recruited some Portuguese soldiers. From here the force proceeded towards Murshidabad that way. This place is about 15 to 20 kilometers north of Chandanagar. This is the Portuguese built famous the Basilica of the Holy Rosary Church in Bengal near Hooghly River bank. By 16th June 1757, the British force reached here at Patuli, about 95 to 100 kilometers north of Chandanagar. Further up from here, about 20 kilometers north, there was a strategically important town of Katwa, where Nawab had a garrison with large stores of grains and military supplies. On 17th June 1757, Clive dispatched a force of 200 Europeans, 500 sepoys, one field piece, and a small cannon under Major Kuti to capture the garrison. Kuti's force travelled that way north from the river loop at Patuli. This is Matieri Ghat on Hooghly River, west bank, about 10 kilometers north from Patuli. And on the other side is the village Matiari in Karen Nadia district. As described by a native of Matiari village who heard the story during his childhood, Robert Clive, after dispatching the force for Katwa, crossed the river at Patuli. Clive then sailed from Patuli along the east bank with his part of the force and halted here in Matieri village, waiting for the news from Major Kuti. This is south bank of Ajay River at the Ajay Hooghly confluence. According to a book of George Bruce Malleson published in 1882, the Nawab's garrison was situated on the north bank of Ajay River, somewhere up there. We could not find the exact location of Nawab's garrison, but this could be a possible place around where the British force from Patuli under Major Kuti arrived. They started from Patuli along the west bank of Hooghly River and arrived here on 18th June 1757. On 19th June 1757, Major Kuti and his force waved a white flag from the south bank of Ajay River, but was met by a gunshot from Nawab's garrison to show defiance. British force then crossed the Ajay River, possibly here, and fired at the rampart. When Nawab's force saw the advancing troops, they gave up their posts and fled north that way. This is Ballabpada ferry ghat on the west bank of the river, and on the other side is the village Ballabpada. This village is between 5 and 10 kilometers from the village Matiari, where Robert Clive had been waiting for news from Major Kuti. Hearing the news of the success, Robert Clive and the rest of the army arrived up there at Ballabpada bank on 20th June 1757. Here Major Kuti's force rejoined along with the grains and artillery left back by Nawab's force at the Katwa garrison. By 21st June, Robert Clive got the news either from British ally Mir Jafar in the Nawab's army or through Warren Hastings, who was posted at Qasim Bazar. The news was that Nawab's entire force advanced towards south to confront British force and reached somewhere near a village called Plassey. On 21st June itself, Clive held a council of war there in the Ballabpada village, and a decision was taken to proceed further. On the morning of 22nd June 1757, the British force proceeded along the east bank of the river up there towards the most possible war location, the village of Plassey. Hearing about British march towards Murshidabad, the Nawab ordered to march his army to intercept the British, but a delay was caused because his grossly unpaid troops refused until the arrears are paid. Finally, the army, led by the Nawab himself, started along the Hooghly River south from Murshidabad, and on 21st June 1757, Nawab's army arrived here about 20 miles south and placed themselves behind a 3 miles long earthen entrenchments running about 200 yards parallel from the river. Here in the village of current Pilkhana is the possible location of the north end of the entrenchment. The Hooghly River is towards west that way, and the entrenchment continued towards south that way. The Nawab's camps were spread along the Hooghly River for about 3 miles inside the entrenchment, and this current village of Rajinagar, about 2 miles south of last location, could be the center of the camp area. The camps were in north that way and south that way. This is current Loknathpur village and should be the south end of the entrenchment. And from here the trench turned right angle towards Hooghly River, thus isolating the camping area from a possible land encounter venue with British. This is current Chowk Bidupada village at the south side of Nawab's camp. On 22nd June, during early morning, Nawab's army emerged from their camps and started advancing towards a muddy field a little south from the camps. Their army consisted of 30,000 infantry of all sorts, armed with swords, pikes, and rockets, and 20,000 cavalry armed with swords or long spears, and 300 pieces of artillery. Nawab's army was led by commanders Mir Madan, Mohan Lal, Mir Jafar, Rai Durlab, Lutuf Khan, and a French artilleryman sent fresh under Commander-in-Chief Nawab Siraj-Ud-Daulah himself. Learning about the British force arriving in this area along the Hooghly River, Nawab's commanders assembled troops up there, almost encircling the river bank. Mir Madan nearest to the river that way, then towards a little east, Mir Qasim somewhere there, Rai Durlab, Luft Khan thereafter towards southeast that way, and the southmost position was of Mir Jafar somewhere up there. Here is this map of the area indicating the Nawab's army camps and army placements as found in one old British document of that time. Finally, the longest day arrived on 23rd June 1757. A little after midnight, British force reached here on the east bank of Hooghly River, a few kilometers north of a village called Plassey. This is Ramnagar ferry ghat near Plassey. Actually, the river has shifted a little west since then, and the actual landing location could be a little east from here that way. Knowing the location of Nawab's camps north from here, British force halted here. On the then bank of Hooghly River, possibly around here, there was an old hunting lodge enclosed by a masonry wall where Robert Clive took up his quarters. British force then quickly occupied an adjoining mango grove, possibly here, then called Lakshabagh, which was about 800 yards and 300 yards area, enclosed by a ditch and a mud wall. The final British army here consisted of 850 European infantry, 2,100 sepoys, and 100 artillerymen assisted by 50 sailors. The commanders were Major James Kilpatrick, Major Alexander Grant, Major Eyre Coote, Major George Frederick, and Captain William Jennings under Commander in Chief Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive. Robert Clive watched this situation from the roof of his hunting lodge, and while anticipating news from Mir Jafar about his alliance with British, ordered his troop to advance from the grove and line up facing the Nawab's army. Commanders then assembled their respective troops likely to be here in this area, encircling the British camp and facing the Nawab's army placements. Kilpatrick closest to the river that way, then Grant towards southeast that way, Coote farther southeast, and Frederick towards south that way. British cannon position was on a small hill a little north of Kilpatrick's troop, possibly up there. This is current Amrokannon landmark and the possible battlefield area. In the area between two camps here, there was a small hill covered by trees. Also, there was a pond near British camp, possibly this way, and a larger pond near Nawab's camp, possibly that way, and a large mud of earth in the middle up there. At sunrise, Nawab's artillery started a heavy and continuous fire, which, although did not serve to demobilize British artillery, but hit the infantry and cavalry divisions, and within half an hour British lost 30 soldiers. Robert Clive then ordered the army to retreat back to the relative shelters at the grove. In next 3 hours, there was no substantial progress and the positions of both sides did not change. Thereafter a heavy rainstorm occurred. The British used tarpaulins to protect their ammunition, while the Nawab's army took no such precaution and gunpowder got wet, reducing their firepower. As the rain began to subside, Mir Madan, whose force assembled near the Hooghly River bank here at the west end of the Nawab's force encirclement, assumed that the British guns were ineffective by the rain and ordered his cavalry to charge. However, the British countered the charge with heavy artillery shots, mortally wounding Mir Madan and driving back his men. At noon, Nawab's army stopped cannon fire and began turning back north to their entrenchments. Seeing the Nawab's force retiring, Major Kilpatrick recognized the opportunity to cannonade the retiring enemy, and by early afternoon, Nawab's artillery position in front of Mir Madan's army, somewhere down there, was taken. Soon after, the British force began cannon fire on the Nawab's camp from the artillery position just captured. Many of the Nawab's troops started coming out of the entrenchment. Robert Clive then advanced half of his troops and artillery to the pond near Nawab's army position and the other half to a raising ground 200 yards to the southeast that way and started firing the Nawab's encirclement. The Nawab's troops also responded, firing guns, hiding behind holes, ditches, hollows and bushes. As a result, the British force sustained most of its casualties in this phase. Here in this area, where the most battle took place. There is a current obelisk of Bakshi Mir Madan and other martyrs Nabe Singh Hazari and Bahadur Ali Khan in memory of patriotism and sacrifice. Nawab remained in his tent throughout the battle, surrounded by officers, assuring him of victory. But when he heard of Mirmadan's death, he was deeply concerned and attempted another reconciliation with Mir Jafar to fight to death. Mir Jafar promised his services but immediately sent word to Robert Clive informing of this, asking him to push forward. Following Mir Jafar's exit from Nawab's tent, Raid-ud-Daulah urged Nawab to withdraw his army behind the entrenchment and advised him to return to Murshidabad, leaving the battle to his generals. Nawab complied with this advice and ordered the troop under Mohanlal to retreat behind the entrenchment. He then mounted a camel and, accompanied by 2000 horsemen, set out for Murshidabad.
আপনি ঠিক জানেন যে এইখানেই পলাশীর যুদ্ধ হয়েছিল?
হ্যাঁ, আমার দাদু বাবাদের মুখে শোনা আর কি। এই ধারে সব আমরা ছোটতে দেখেছি, এইগুলি কামান ফিট করা ছিল, ইটের স্তম্ভের ওপরে সিমেন্ট দিয়ে কামান তৈরি করা ছিল। ওই ধারে মুখ করা ছিল সব কাজ করে, এ ধারেও ছিল। হ্যাঁ, এই ধারে কামান ছিল।
এই কামানগুলো কি আগে থেকেই বসানো ছিল?
হ্যাঁ, আগে থেকেই বসানো ছিল, সিমেন্টের উপরে তৈরি করা ছিল।
আচ্ছা, সিমেন্টের উপরে
সিমেন্টের ইট দিয়ে গেঁথে পাকাই ইট দিয়ে কামান 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 রাখা ছিল।
তো এই যে কামানগুলো এখান থেকে এরা কারা, মানে সিরাজদৌল্লার লোকই এই কামান ছুটতো?
না, এটা সিরাজদৌল্লা আর ইংরেজদের ছেলেটা
সেই সময় এই কামানটা তৈরি করে বসানো হয়েছিল। ধন্যবাদ, ধন্যবাদ।
The fighting continued, and by the afternoon, the regiment under Major Kuti took the hill in between the two camps, which had Nawab's cannon, and then the Nawab's army fled without firing a shot. Kuti pursued them across the entrenchment, and by the late afternoon or early evening, the British force occupied the Nawab's entrenchment and the camps left by the dispersing army. Clive estimated that Nawab's force lost 500 men, including several key officers. Also being under alliance with British, there was no fight from Mir Jafar's army positions, which was the last on the encirclement on south side. Here there is a current Plassey monument, stands as a memorial of the war. The monument has a statue of last independent Nawab Siraj-Ud-Daulah. Before we depart from here, the last look at the battlefield of Plassey. Here there is an old British map of the possible warfield. Here is also an old British time painting of the war. British troops then marched on and halted at the fall of the night here at Hooghly River bank near current Dadpur village, then called Daudpur, about 10 kilometers north. In the meantime, during the evening of 23rd June 1757, Robert Clive received a letter from Mir Jafar asking for a meeting with him. Clive replied that he would meet Mir Jafar at his Dadpur camp the next morning. When Mir Jafar arrived at the British camp here at Daudpur in the morning of 24th June 1757, Clive embraced and saluted him as the Nawab of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and advised him to return immediately to Murshidabad to prevent Nawab's escape. This is British cemetery in Qasim Bazar. Warren Hastings used to live here in Qasim Bazar, managing in business during the Plassey War. Robert Clive passed through here on the way to Murshidabad and met Warren Hastings when he appointed Hastings to reside in the court of new Nawab after Siraj-Ud-Daulah as an agent of British India Company. Warren Hastings' house was in a place called Barrack Square, should be somewhere nearby, but unfortunately we could not locate this place because today no one knows where was Barrack Square. Warren Hastings' wife and daughter were buried here in this cemetery, and here ahead is the plaque in commemoration. Qasim Bazar was then the main trading center, mostly of silk, and Murshidabad had only Nawab Palace, court, public offices, and the harems. The Nawab's palace, known as Hiraj Hill Palace, was on the west bank of Hooghly River here, opposite Jafarganj, about 5 kilometers north of Murshidabad city. The palace, which was huge with a pleasure garden Hiraj Hill, except for some ruins, does not exist anymore, as the most of it went inside the river due to the river changing course with time. Realizing the defeat at Plassey and treachery of Mir Jafar, Nawab returned to his palace here in Murshidabad at midnight on 23rd June 1757. He then summoned a council where some advised him to surrender to British, some to continue the war, and some to prolong his fight. Meanwhile, upon advice of Robert Clive, Mir Jafar quickly returned to Murshidabad with his troop in the evening of 24 June 1757, not only to prevent Nawab's escape but also to loot his treasure. At around midnight of 24th June 1757, Nawab disguised himself and escaped northwards, possibly that way, on a boat with his wife and valuable jewels. His intention was to escape to Patna by boat, where he had alliance. In the meantime, Mir Jafar, learning this, immediately sent several parties in search of the Nawab. Robert Clive arrived here in Murshidabad on 29th June 1757 with a guard of soldiers amidst a rumor of a possible attempt on his life. Clive was then taken to Nawab's palace, where he was received by Mir Jafar and his officers. Robert Clive then placed Mir Jafar on the throne, acknowledging his position as the new Nawab, and presented him with a plate of gold rupees. The Nawab was eventually arrested on his way to Patna by Mirzafar's brother. On 2nd July 1757, Nawab was handed over to Mirzafar's son Miran in Murshidabad and an execution order was issued. It was here at the then palace of Mir Jafar, a little north of Hazarduari, the Nawab Mirza Muhammad Siraj-Ud-Daulah was killed on the same night. The execution was carried by a Mirzafar's assistant Muhammad Ali Beg, ending Nawab's only 1 year 2 months reign since he succeeded his grandfather Nawab Ali Bardi Khan at his demise. That was the end of independent Nawab era in India. This is the old palace of Mirzafar in Jafarganj near Katgola. Next morning, Nawab's body was paraded on the streets of Murshidabad. This is river bank in Murshidabad. His body was cremated on the other side of the river in Khoshbagh that way. This is Khoshbagh, the burial ground of the Nawab family. Here lies the tomb of the Nawab clan. Finally, he was buried in Khoshbagh, and here ahead is his tomb. He was buried by the side of his grandfather Nawab Ali Bardi Khan. Here ahead is the tomb of Ali Bardi Khan. Nawab Mirza Muhammad Siraj-Ud-Daulah lies here. Sunset of Nawab era and sunrise of East India Company. To give a geographic idea of Robert Clive's journey for Plassey War along the current Hooghly River, here is the map of today's West Bengal, and the war journey was at the southern part of West Bengal up here. The journey started from Falta here, then Achipur, then Shivpur in Howrah district, then Adi Ganga in Hastings area of Calcutta, then Chandanagar, Chuchura, Bandal, then Patuli, Matiari, Katwa, finally Plassey where the war took place, then Daudpur, and finally Murshidabad. Since 1757, India remained under British rule for about 200 years till independence in 1947. And many waters have flown through this Hooghly River ever since. This is Binoy Bala signing off from our starting point, again at the bank of Hooghly River in Calcutta, or today's Kolkata, name changed in 2001, and at the Fort William, today's Fort William, built in 1781.